A dying veteran followed his German shepherd onto a frozen lake. What the dog found exposed a 40-year secret fortune. Left with nothing, old veteran found an abandoned ship. His German shepherd found the vault Mason Cole had 7 days before he lost everything. The former Navy SEAL lived alone in an aging camper beside Flathead Lake, haunted by war, grief, and the memory of the wife he couldn't save. Then, one icy morning, his retired German shepherd, Ranger, abandoned their usual path and led him deep into a hidden inlet. Rising from the frozen fog stood a ship that should not have existed, and a secret powerful men had spent decades trying to bury. Before we begin, comment 1 or 0 below and tell us where you're watching from today. The nightmare always began with water. Black water, cold water, water so dark it swallowed light. Mason Cole jerked awake with a sharp gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a few disorienting seconds, he wasn't inside his camper overlooking Flathead Lake. He was back in another place, another time. He could hear rotor blades chopping through the darkness. He could hear men shouting over a radio. He could feel icy water climbing higher around his legs. The mission had happened nearly 30 years ago, yet some nights it felt like yesterday. A warm weight pressed firmly against his chest. Mason blinked. The darkness of the nightmare slowly dissolved. A familiar brown face appeared inches from his own. Ranger. The German shepherd stood beside the narrow bed, one paw resting against Mason's blanket. His ears were forward. His amber eyes remained locked on Mason's face. Watching. Waiting. Making sure he came back. Mason let out a slow breath. "It's okay, partner." Ranger didn't move. The dog had learned long ago that sometimes Mason said those words before the panic attack truly passed. Outside, winter wind rattled the aluminum siding of the aging camper. Snow tapped lightly against the small windows. Flathead Lake slept beneath a blanket of ice and darkness. The old SEAL slowly sat up. Every joint complained. 69 years old. Some mornings it felt like 90. Ranger finally relaxed when Mason swung his legs over the side of the bed. The dog nudged his hand. A silent inspection. "You alive? You staying here? You with me?" Mason scratched behind Ranger's ears. "Yeah," he whispered. "Still here." The German shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor. Only once. Ranger had never been a dog that wasted energy. The camper was barely 20 feet long, a tiny kitchen, a folding table, a propane heater, a narrow bed. Most people would have called it miserable. To Mason, it was simply what remained. He stood and shuffled toward the small sink. The digital clock above the counter glowed 4:17 a.m., too early. But sleep wasn't coming back. Not tonight. He poured himself coffee left over from the previous evening and stared through the frosted window. The marina below looked abandoned. Most of the docks sat empty. The lake beyond disappeared into darkness. Only a few security lights reflected across the frozen shoreline. 20 years ago, this place had been alive. Families, fishing boats, summer tourists, children running along the docks. Now most of the property belonged to developers. Luxury cabins, vacation homes, people with money, people who had never worried about medical bills. His eyes drifted toward a white envelope sitting on the table. He already knew every word inside. Still, he picked it up. The paper crackled softly. Final notice. The words seemed larger every time he read them. Property redevelopment begins in 7 days. All temporary structures must be removed. 7 days. That was all. 7 days until he lost the last place he could afford. 7 days until the camper had nowhere to go. 7 days until he and Ranger became something he had spent his entire life trying not to become. Homeless. Mason folded the letter carefully. The strange thing was that he wasn't angry anymore. Anger required energy. Somewhere over the past 3 years, exhaustion had replaced it. His gaze drifted to a photograph attached to the refrigerator with a magnet. Emily. She stood smiling beneath a summer sunset. Her hair moved gently in the wind. The smile was the same smile that had carried them through deployments, military moves, financial struggles, and ordinary years. 38 years together. Then cancer arrived. The treatments, the surgeries, the travel, the specialists, the endless bills. Mason would have sold the entire world if it had bought her one more day. Instead, it bought nothing. The ranch went first, then the savings, then the retirement account, then nearly everything else. Emily had been gone for 3 years. The debt remained. The old seal stared at her picture. Morning, sweetheart. The camper remained silent. Ranger quietly walked over and rested beside Mason's chair. The dog remembered her too. Animals understood loss better than people realized. Outside, dawn slowly began to creep over the mountains. The peaks surrounding Flathead Lake emerged from darkness one by one. White snow covered the forests. Pine trees stretched across the hillsides. The entire landscape looked beautiful enough for a postcard, and lonely enough to break a man's heart. By 6 o'clock, Mason pulled on his heavy coat. Ranger was already waiting by the door. Some things never changed. No matter how difficult life became, they still took their morning walk. The cold slapped Mason's face the moment they stepped outside. Fresh snow crunched beneath his boots. Ranger moved ahead, nose low to the ground. The marina looked even older in daylight. Weathered wood, rusting metal, empty slips, abandoned equipment. Like Mason, it felt forgotten. They followed the shoreline path. The frozen lake stretched endlessly toward the distant mountains. For a while, neither man nor dog made a sound. That was another thing Ranger understood. Sometimes silence was necessary. Halfway down the shoreline trail, Mason stopped. A familiar pickup truck sat near the marina office. The logo on the door immediately tightened his stomach. Holloway Development Group. A younger man stepped out carrying a clipboard. He wore an expensive winter jacket, clean boots, the look of someone who had never spent a night worrying about survival. The man smiled politely. "Mr. Cole?" Mason nodded. The man glanced toward the camper. "Just making final preparations." Mason said nothing. The man shifted awkwardly. "We mailed several notices. I got them." "Then you understand." Mason looked across the frozen lake. "I understand." The man hesitated. For a brief moment he seemed almost embarrassed. Then he returned to the truck. A minute later, the vehicle disappeared down the snowy road. Ranger watched until it vanished. The dog let out a low huff. Mason chuckled softly. "Yeah." Ranger looked up. "I don't like them much either." For the first time that morning, a faint smile crossed Mason's face. Only Ranger could still make that happen. The walk continued. The trail curved around the shoreline and disappeared between stands of pine trees. Snow drifted from the branches overhead. A bald eagle soared high above the frozen lake. The world seemed calm, peaceful. Yet beneath that calm sat a question Mason couldn't escape. What happened in 7 days? He had no answer. No family nearby. No money. No backup plan. Just a camper, a dog, and whatever strength remained inside him. They returned to the marina near noon. The wind had strengthened. Clouds rolled across the mountains. A storm was coming. Mason stepped inside the camper and removed his gloves. The heater clicked softly. Ranger settled beside the door. The old seal looked around the cramped space. Every object carried a memory. A coffee mug Emily once used, an old Navy photograph, a worn blanket, the leash hanging by the entrance, the life of a man reduced to a handful of possessions. His eyes found the eviction notice again. 7 days. The words felt heavier now. Outside, snow began falling harder. Inside, Ranger lifted his head and watched Mason carefully. The old seal walked over and sat beside him. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Mason placed a hand on the dog's neck. The thick fur felt warm, solid, real. The kind of certainty he hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what we're gonna do, buddy." Ranger leaned against him. Mason swallowed hard. For a moment, the loneliness threatened to overwhelm him. Not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of feeling forgotten, of feeling left behind by time, by luck, by life itself. But Ranger remained there, steady as a heartbeat, unmoving, faithful. Outside, the storm continued gathering over Flathead Lake. Snow swept across the frozen water. Far beyond the marina, hidden somewhere among the cliffs and forgotten inlets of the mountain lake, something waited beneath the ice. Neither Mason nor Ranger knew it yet. But in exactly 7 days, everything would change, and it would begin with a path Ranger had never taken before. The storm passed sometime during the night. When Mason Cole stepped outside the camper the following morning, the world looked freshly rebuilt. Snow covered everything. The docks, the marina office, the empty boat slips. Even the rusted fuel pumps near the shoreline wore white caps of ice. The mountains surrounding Flathead Lake glowed pale gold beneath the rising sun. For a few moments, the view almost made him forget the letter sitting on his table. Almost. Ranger bounded down the camper steps ahead of him. The German shepherd seemed unusually alert. His ears stood higher than normal. His nose lifted repeatedly into the cold morning air. Mason noticed immediately. Years of working together had taught him how to read the dog better than most people. "What is it, partner?" Ranger glanced toward the shoreline, then toward the pine-covered hills, then back at Mason. The dog gave a short huff. Mason smiled faintly. "Yeah. Me too." He clipped on Ranger's leash out of habit, though both of them knew it wasn't necessary. Ranger had followed commands under gunfire. A simple morning walk wasn't exactly a challenge. They started down the familiar trail that followed the frozen edge of the lake. Every morning for nearly 3 years, they had walked the same route, past the abandoned boathouse, across the weathered wooden footbridge, along the narrow shoreline path beneath the pines. Routine mattered, especially after Emily died. Routine gave structure to days that otherwise felt empty. Mason reached the footbridge. Ranger stopped. The dog stared toward the trees. His body became still, very still. Mason frowned. That wasn't normal. Ranger wasn't looking at wildlife. He wasn't tracking deer. He wasn't distracted by scent. He looked focused, purposeful, the way he had looked during missions. "What do you see?" Ranger took 3 steps off the trail, then 6 more, straight into the forest. Mason blinked. The German shepherd never did that. Not here. Not on this trail. Not after years of following the same route. "Ranger." The dog paused, looked back, then continued walking. Mason sighed. "Well, that's new." Snow crunched beneath his boots as he followed. The woods quickly swallowed the morning light. Towering pines blocked the sun. Frost coated every branch. The forest felt untouched, ancient, silent. Ranger moved steadily ahead, not running, not wandering, leading. Mason's curiosity slowly replaced his confusion. The dog clearly knew where he was going. The question was why. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Soon they were far beyond any place Mason had explored before. Steep granite cliffs rose above them. The terrain became rougher. Narrow game trails wound through thick stands of timber. Several times Mason nearly lost sight of Ranger entirely. Yet every time he called, the dog reappeared briefly before continuing forward, almost as if he were checking to make sure Hassan remained behind him. The old seal eventually stopped, his breathing fogged in the cold air. "We're getting lost, buddy." Ranger ignored him, for the first time in years. The dog continued deeper into the forest. Mason laughed softly. "Guess we're doing this your way today." The trees suddenly began thinning. A strange gray mist drifted through the woods ahead. The air smelled different, colder, damp, lake water. Ranger accelerated. Mason followed. A moment later, he stepped out of the forest and froze. The world opened before him. A hidden inlet stretched between towering cliffs. The narrow body of water cut deep into the mountainside like a forgotten wound. Fog drifted across the frozen surface. Jagged rock walls rose hundreds of feet on both sides. The place felt isolated from the rest of Flathead Lake, almost secret. Mason stared. He had lived near the lake for years, yet somehow he had never seen this place. Ranger trotted onto a rocky overlook near the shoreline, then stopped. The dog stood perfectly still, looking outward. Mason followed his gaze. At first, he saw only fog. Snow. Ice. Then something dark emerged. A shape. Massive. Impossible. His eyes narrowed. The fog shifted, and the shape revealed itself. Steel. Rust. A towering wall of steel rising from the frozen inlet. Mason's breath caught. No way. The fog continued moving. More of the object appeared. A bow. Deck structures. A bridge. The unmistakable silhouette of a ship. A huge ship, frozen solid into the lake. Mason stood motionless. His military instincts immediately rejected what his eyes were seeing. Ships like that belonged on oceans, harbors, ports, not hidden inside a remote Montana mountain lake, not where nobody could see them, not where nobody talked about them. Yet there it was. Real. Silent. Waiting. The vessel stretched across the ice like a sleeping giant. Rust streaked its sides. Snow covered portions of the deck. Years of weather had scarred the steel. Still, the ship remained enormous, larger than any fishing vessel, larger than most commercial boats that ever visited the region. "What are you?" Ranger barked once. The sound echoed between the cliffs. The ship offered no answer. Mason stepped closer to the shoreline. The frozen inlet groaned softly beneath the winter wind. His heart had begun beating faster. Not from fear, from something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement, curiosity, purpose. Questions flooded his mind. How long had it been here? Who owned it? Why had nobody reported it? Why hide something this large? The former SEAL studied the vessel carefully. Certain details immediately bothered him. There were no visible markings, no company logo, no registration numbers, nothing obvious identifying the ship. That alone felt wrong. Very wrong. Ranger suddenly moved forward. The German shepherd stepped onto the frozen inlet. One careful paw at a time, then another. His nose pointed directly toward the ship. Mason watched him. The dog wasn't afraid. If anything, Ranger seemed determined, as though he had finally found what he had been searching for. The old SEAL looked back toward the distant forest, the marina, the camper, the eviction notice waiting on the table. 7 days. 7 days until everything ended. Or maybe not. For the first time since Emily's death, a small spark ignited somewhere deep inside him. The feeling surprised him. Hope. Tiny. Fragile, but real. Ranger barked again, this time louder. The sound echoed across the frozen inlet, across the cliffs, across the silent steel giant trapped in the ice. Mason stared at the abandoned vessel, then at his dog, then back at the ship. A smile slowly appeared beneath his gray beard. "All right, partner." He adjusted his coat. His eyes never left the massive silhouette ahead. "Let's go find out what you've been trying to show me." Together, the old Navy SEAL and his loyal German shepherd stepped onto the frozen inlet and toward the impossible ship waiting in the fog. Neither of them knew it yet. But buried inside that forgotten vessel was a secret that would reach back decades. A secret powerful people had spent years trying to keep hidden. And Ranger had just found the first clue. The frozen inlet stretched silently before them. Wind drifted through the narrow canyon between the cliffs, carrying fine snow across the ice in ghostly ribbons. Mason Cole walked carefully behind Ranger. The German shepherd moved with surprising confidence, as if he had already accepted the massive ship as part of the landscape. The vessel grew larger with every step. What had seemed enormous from the overlook now felt overwhelming. Its rusted hull towered above the frozen inlet like a steel mountain. Decades of snow, wind, and neglect had scarred its surface. Yet the structure remained intimidating. Powerful. Mason stopped roughly 50 yards from the bow. His military instincts immediately began cataloging details. Hull thickness, deck height, bridge position, construction style. This wasn't a cargo ship, at least not a normal one. The reinforced steel plating along the lower hull looked unusually heavy. The bow appeared designed for impact, possibly ice-breaking, possibly military. Maybe both. Ranger reached the ship first. The dog began circling the frozen base of the hull, sniffing, investigating, searching. Mason approached slowly. His boots crunched against the ice. The vessel's name should have been visible near the bow. Instead, he found only scarred metal. Large rectangular marks showed where identifying plates had once been attached. Removed, deliberately. That immediately bothered him. Ships carried names, ownership records, registration markings. Removing them required effort and purpose. Why would somebody erase your identity? The ship remained silent. A narrow metal ladder hung down one side of the hull, corroded, frozen, yet surprisingly intact. Mason grabbed the lowest rung. The steel felt solid. He looked down at Ranger. "What do you think?" The German shepherd stared back. His ears stood upright, alert, waiting. The same expression he'd worn during missions overseas when awaiting a command. Mason laughed softly. "Yeah, I know." The old SEAL took a breath, then started climbing. The ladder creaked beneath his weight. Wind tugged at his jacket. For a brief moment he felt younger. Not 69, not a widower, not a man facing eviction, just a Navy operator climbing toward an unknown objective. The feeling startled him. He hadn't felt that way in years. At the top, Mason swung himself onto the deck. The vast steel surface stretched before him. Snow covered much of it. Ice clung to railings. Rust stained nearly every structure. Yet something felt strange. The ship didn't look destroyed. It looked abandoned. There was a difference. A destroyed ship told a story of violence, a fire, a collision, a storm, an accident. An abandoned ship told a story of people leaving, and leaving quickly. Mason walked forward. His footsteps echoed across the deck. The sound seemed unnaturally loud. The surrounding cliffs trapped every noise. The ship almost felt alive, watching, waiting. Ranger barked below. Mason leaned over the railing. The dog stood directly beneath him, watching, guarding. The old seal nodded. "I'll be careful." Ranger remained where he was, satisfied. For now. Mason continued exploring. The bridge sat near the center of the vessel. Its windows were cracked but mostly intact. The door hung partially open. He stepped inside. The air smelled ancient, cold metal, dust, old oil. The bridge looked frozen in time. Navigation consoles lined the walls, control panels, communication equipment, weathered maps. Most were covered in frost. Mason slowly brushed snow from a metal surface. The lettering beneath made him pause. Russian. His eyes narrowed. Interesting. Very interesting. He continued searching. Several labels throughout the bridge used Cyrillic characters. Others had been scratched away entirely. Cold War era. Without question, a Soviet vessel. But that only deepened the mystery. How had a Soviet ship ended up hidden inside a Montana lake? The answer made no sense. Mason left the bridge and entered a narrow interior corridor. Darkness swallowed him immediately. He pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket. The beam illuminated rusted walls, pipes, steel doors, rows of empty compartments. His footsteps echoed softly. Every room told the same story. Crew quarters, storage areas, workstations. Yet everywhere he looked, signs of life remained. Blankets, coffee mugs, old clothing, personal belongings. The crew hadn't packed. They hadn't cleaned. They hadn't prepared to leave. It looked as though they simply walked away one day and never returned. A chill ran through him. Not fear. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive through dangerous situations years earlier. Something about this ship felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Ranger barked again outside. This time the sound came from a different location. Moving, circling, still investigating. Mason continued deeper. The corridors twisted through the ship like veins. Most led nowhere important. But one room caught his attention immediately. An office. Small. Windowless. The door stood partially open. Inside, a metal desk remained bolted to the floor. Several filing cabinets lined the walls. Most were empty. Their contents removed long ago. But one drawer remained stuck. Mason tugged it open. Inside lay a thin stack of papers, frozen together. Fragile. He carefully separated them. The documents were damaged. Water stains covered much of the text. Yet certain words remained readable. Coordinates, cargo, transfer authorization. His pulse quickened. Then he found something else. A symbol stamped repeatedly across multiple pages. A black anchor inside a circle. Beneath it appeared several typed words. Project Iron Harbor. Mason read the phrase twice. Project Iron Harbor. He had never heard of it. Yet something about the name felt important. Official. Classified. Military. The pages contained references to shipment schedules and restricted cargo transfers. Unfortunately, much of the information had been destroyed. Sections were blacked out. Others torn away completely. Someone had intentionally removed critical details. Mason slipped the papers into his coat pocket. His curiosity had officially become an obsession. What exactly had Project Iron Harbor been? And why had somebody worked so hard to erase it? A sudden growl echoed through the corridor. Mason froze. The sound came from outside. Ranger. Not barking. Growling. His body instantly tensed. Years of training activated automatically. The old seal moved toward the nearest window, carefully, quietly. He peered through the frost-covered glass. Nothing. Only snow, ice, cliffs, the frozen inlet. Yet Ranger continued growling, low, steady, focused. Mason scanned the shoreline. His eyes narrowed. Had something moved? A shadow? A figure? For a brief moment he thought he saw movement near the trees. Then it vanished. Gone. Maybe his imagination. Maybe not. Ranger rarely reacted without reason. The dog trusted his senses. Mason trusted Ranger. That simple. After several tense moments, the growling stopped. The forest returned to silence, but the uneasy feeling remained. The old seal stood motionless, watching, listening, waiting. Eventually, he stepped away from the window. Whatever had triggered Ranger's warning was gone. For now. He resumed exploring. The lower sections of the ship proved even stranger. Several corridors had been sealed with welded steel plates. Entire compartments appeared intentionally blocked off, as if someone wanted to prevent access or hide something. Mason ran his hand across one of the welded barriers. The workmanship looked professional, deliberate, expensive. Whoever sealed these areas had resources and time. Questions continued piling up faster than answers. Hours passed. The winter sun slowly drifted lower across the sky. Eventually, Mason returned to the main deck. Ranger immediately trotted toward him. The dog inspected him thoroughly before relaxing. Mission complete. Partner safe. Mason scratched behind the dog's ears. You were right. Ranger wagged his tail once. The old seal turned and looked back at the ship. The giant vessel stood motionless beneath the gray sky. Silent. Mysterious. Impossible. He thought about the documents in his pocket. Project Iron Harbor, the missing markings, the abandoned crew quarters, the sealed corridors, the strange feeling that someone had tried to erase this ship from history. None of it made sense. Yet one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't merely an abandoned vessel. It was a secret. A very old secret. And somehow, against all odds, he and Ranger had stumbled directly into it. The winter wind swept across the frozen inlet. Ranger lifted his head. His eyes remained fixed on the ship. Not ready to leave. Not yet. Mason followed the dog's gaze. Then he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Near the lower stern section, partially hidden beneath layers of snow and rust, a narrow access hatch stood slightly open, only a few inches, barely noticeable, yet definitely there. Mason stared. The hatch hadn't appeared on any visible deck plans, and judging by its location, it led somewhere deep below, very deep. Ranger stepped forward. The German shepherd's ears rose. His body became alert once again. The dog had found something else, something important. Mason felt the first genuine surge of excitement he had experienced in years. Whatever lay beyond that hidden hatch, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, they were coming back, and next time, they were going deeper. The thought stayed with Mason Cole the entire walk back to the marina. The hidden hatch, the abandoned Soviet vessel, Project Iron Harbor, the sealed corridors, the feeling that someone had tried to erase the ship from history. By the time he and Ranger emerged from the forest, the winter sun was already sinking behind the mountains. Long shadows stretched across the frozen shoreline. The temperature dropped rapidly. Flathead Lake seemed to grow quieter with every passing minute. Mason glanced back toward the distant cliffs one final time. The hidden inlet had vanished behind the trees. If he hadn't seen it himself, he might have believed the ship was nothing more than a dream. but the folded documents inside his coat pocket proved otherwise. Ranger trotted beside him, occasionally glancing up, checking, always checking. The dog had been doing that for years, ever since the mission. The mission Mason rarely allowed himself to think about. The mission that returned every night anyway. Back at the camper, darkness settled quickly. Snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the marina lights. The old heater hummed in the corner. Mason heated a can of soup on the small stove while Ranger rested near the door. For the first time in months, Mason found himself distracted from the eviction notice. His thoughts kept returning to the ship. Questions multiplied. Who abandoned it? Why was it hidden inside a mountain lake? Why remove its identity? And why did the words Project Iron Harbor sound strangely familiar? He unfolded the damaged papers again. The pages were brittle, water-stained, partially destroyed. Several coordinates appeared repeatedly. Dates from the late 1980s. Cargo transfer records. Military references. Yet every time he reached a potentially important section, the information disappeared beneath black ink or torn paper. Someone had wanted those answers buried. Mason stared at the symbol stamped across multiple pages, a black anchor enclosed inside a circle. Something about it tugged at his memory, just out of reach, like a face seen years ago, like a voice heard through fog. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. The German shepherd watched Mason carefully. The old seal realized he had been staring at the same page for nearly 10 minutes. His hands were trembling slightly. He folded the documents, put them away, and rubbed his eyes. Getting old, partner. Ranger remained unconvinced. The dog continued watching him, the same way he always did when the memories started creeping closer. Outside, the wind strengthened. Snow tapped softly against the windows. The familiar sound triggered something deep inside Mason's mind. Metal, wind, darkness, water. For a brief moment, the camper disappeared. He was somewhere else, somewhere colder, somewhere far more dangerous. Mason blinked hard. The vision vanished, but uneasiness remained. Hours later, he finally climbed into bed. Ranger settled beside him. The heater clicked softly. The storm outside continued building. Mason closed his eyes. Sleep arrived quickly. The nightmare arrived faster. At first there was only darkness. Then came the sound. Rotor blades. A helicopter. The unmistakable chop of spinning blades cutting through freezing rain. Mason found himself standing ankle-deep in black water. His younger hands gripped a rifle. Rain hammered against his face. The world flashed red. Emergency lights. Warning lights. Somewhere nearby, men shouted over radios. The words were impossible to understand. Yet the fear felt perfectly real. A storm raged around them. Waves crashed against steel. The extraction had gone wrong. Everything had gone wrong. Mason knew this place. Knew this moment. The memory had followed him for nearly 30 years. A covert mission near Arctic waters. A rescue operation. A team trapped during a violent storm. A decision that still haunted him. The nightmare unfolded exactly as it always did. One teammate slipping, another disappearing into darkness, the radio failing, the helicopter forced away by weather. Then the sound. A voice calling for help. A voice Mason never managed to reach. The guilt struck him like a knife. He ran. The freezing water rose higher. The storm grew louder. The voice kept calling. Then suddenly, the voice changed. No longer his teammate. No longer the mission. Now the voice belonged to Emily. Mason. The darkness twisted. The ocean became the frozen inlet. The storm became Flathead Lake. The distant silhouette of the abandoned ship emerged through the snow. The hidden hatch stood open, waiting, calling. "Mason!" His wife's voice echoed again. The ship's rusted hull groaned. "Project Iron Harbor." The words appeared across the steel, then disappeared beneath blood-red water. "Mason." The old SEAL stumbled forward, desperate, confused. The nightmare no longer followed memory. It followed fear. Fear of losing Emily again. Fear of failing again. Fear of arriving too late, just as he always had. The ship's hidden hatch opened wider. Darkness waited inside. Something moved beneath the water. Something enormous. Something unseen. Then a hand reached upward from the darkness. Mason lunged forward, trying to grab it, trying to save whoever was there, trying to fix something that could never be fixed. His fingers almost touched. A sharp bark shattered everything. The nightmare exploded apart. Mason woke violently, his chest heaving. Sweat covered his face despite the cold. The camper door stood open. Snow blew inside. Wind howled through the darkness. For a moment he couldn't understand what was happening. Then he saw Ranger. The German shepherd stood directly in front of him, blocking the doorway. Barking. Insistent. Urgent. Mason looked down. His boots were on. His coat hung half-buttoned around his shoulders. He had no memory of putting them on. A chill ran through him. The nightmare had followed him into the waking world. Again. The realization hit hard. He had been sleepwalking. The old SEAL slowly lowered himself into a chair. Ranger immediately approached, pressing against his leg, grounding him, anchoring him, keeping him here, keeping him present. The storm outside raged across Flathead Lake. Had Ranger not stopped him, Mason might have wandered into it. The thought left him shaken. For several minutes, neither moved. The only sounds came from the wind and the heater. Finally, Mason rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Thank you." Ranger leaned closer. The old SEAL swallowed hard. He rarely spoke about the nightmares, rarely spoke about the mission, rarely spoke about Emily. But sitting there in the darkness, he understood something. Ranger had saved his life more than once. Not overseas, not during combat. Here, afterward, when nobody else could. The dog remained beside him until dawn. As the first gray light appeared over the mountains, Mason sat quietly at the table. A fresh cup of coffee steamed in his hands. The damaged Project Iron Harbor documents lay nearby. His eyes drifted across the pages, then stopped. One line suddenly stood out, a reference he had overlooked before. Arctic Transfer Operations. The phrase triggered a memory, a conversation. Years ago, two SEAL operators talking during deployment. Rumors about a classified Cold War logistics project. Unmarked vessels, hidden cargo, government denials. Nobody had known whether the stories were true. Most dismissed them as military legends. Yet now, Mason looked toward the snowy window, toward the distant mountains, toward the hidden inlet beyond them. Maybe the stories had been real. Maybe the ship wasn't simply abandoned. Maybe it had been hidden, intentionally. The old SEAL felt a knot tightening in his stomach. Not fear, certainty. Whatever waited inside that vessel was bigger than he originally believed. Far bigger. Ranger lifted his head. The German shepherd's ears perked toward the door. Ready, expectant, as if he already knew where they were going next. Mason looked at him, then toward the fading storm outside. A faint determination replaced the exhaustion in his eyes. "You know something, don't you?" Ranger wagged his tail once. The old SEAL smiled, for the first time since waking from the nightmare. Tomorrow had become today, and somewhere inside that ghost ship hidden among the mountains, answers were waiting. Whether they brought salvation or trouble remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. Mason Cole was no longer walking away. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Low clouds hung over Flathead Lake. The mountains disappeared behind curtains of drifting snow. Winter seemed determined to hide the world. Yet Mason felt more awake than he had in years. Purpose had a way of doing that. The old seal finished his coffee before sunrise. Ranger was already waiting by the door. The German shepherd's ears stood high, alert, focused, almost impatient. Mason grabbed his heavy coat and flashlight. The folded Project Iron Harbor documents rested safely inside his jacket pocket. He checked them twice, then looked at Ranger. "Let's see what else that ship is hiding." Ranger immediately stood. "Ready." Within minutes, they were following the now familiar route through the forest. Snow creaked beneath their feet. Cold air filled their lungs. The hidden inlet remained invisible until the last moment. Then the trees opened. The cliffs appeared, and beyond them, the ghost ship waited exactly where they had left it. Silent, massive, watching. Mason studied the frozen inlet carefully before stepping onto the ice. Years of military training had made observation second nature. Something immediately caught his attention. He stopped. Ranger stopped too. The old seal crouched near the shoreline. Fresh tracks, boot prints, several sets. Not his, not recent snowfall either. The impressions looked less than a day old. Someone else had been here. His pulse quickened. Mason slowly examined the area. The tracks led toward the inlet, then disappeared where drifting snow had covered them. He followed the trail farther. Near a stand of pines, another clue waited. Tire tracks. Deep. Fresh. The vehicle had parked less than 200 yards from the hidden inlet. His stomach tightened. Nobody came here by accident. Nobody. Especially during winter. Ranger lowered his nose and sniffed the ground. Then the dog emitted a low growl. The sound instantly sharpened Mason's attention. "What do you have?" Ranger lifted his head, his gaze fixed on the forest beyond the tracks. The growl deepened. Not aggressive. Warning. The kind of warning Ranger only gave when he sensed people. Mason slowly scanned the trees. Nothing. Only snow, pines, wind. Yet the feeling remained. Someone had been here, recently, watching. The old seal trusted Ranger more than his own instincts, and Ranger clearly didn't like something. "Stay sharp, partner." Together they crossed the frozen inlet. The ship rose above them like a steel fortress. Mason climbed aboard once again. This time he headed directly toward the hidden hatch he had discovered the previous day. The narrow opening remained partially exposed beneath snow and rust. He knelt beside it, examining the hinges. Old, corroded, yet recently disturbed. The realization sent another chill through him. The snow immediately surrounding the hatch looked different. Compressed. Shifted. As though someone had inspected it not long ago. Mason stared at the metal surface. Questions multiplied. Who knew about this ship? How many people had discovered it? And why hadn't anyone claimed it? Ranger barked sharply. Once, then twice. The old seal turned. The German shepherd stood near the starboard railing, looking toward the cliffs. His body was rigid, focused. Mason moved beside him. "What is it?" The dog continued staring. Mason followed his line of sight. At first he saw nothing. Then movement. Tiny. Brief. A dark shape high on a distant ridge. Gone almost immediately. But it had been there. He was certain. A person. watching. The old seal's jaw tightened. The feeling from yesterday returned stronger than ever. The ship wasn't abandoned, at least not completely. Someone cared enough to monitor it. Someone cared enough to visit. Someone cared enough to watch strangers who approached. The realization changed everything. Suddenly, the mystery felt far more dangerous. Mason remained at the railing for nearly 5 minutes. The figure never reappeared. Eventually, he turned back toward the ship. There was nothing he could do about distant shadows. Not yet. But he would remember. Every detail, every clue, every movement. The hidden hatch led into a narrow lower compartment. Dust covered everything. The space appeared unused for decades. Pipes lined the walls. Storage lockers stood open. Most were empty. Some contained scattered paperwork destroyed by moisture. Mason searched carefully, room by room, compartment by compartment. Hours passed. Several times Ranger wandered ahead, exploring passages the old seal hadn't yet reached. Each time the dog returned. Each time he seemed frustrated, as though he knew something remained hidden. By early afternoon, Mason finally climbed back onto the main deck. The sky had darkened. Snow began falling again. The inlet looked even more isolated than before, a prison of ice and stone. His eyes drifted once more toward the distant ridge. Nothing moved, yet the uneasy feeling remained. Someone had definitely been there, and they knew about the ship. The walk back to town felt longer than usual. Questions followed every step. When they finally reached the marina, Mason decided to stop at the only diner still operating through winter. The building sat near the main road overlooking the lake. Warm yellow light glowed from its windows, a welcome contrast to the gray landscape outside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. Several locals sat at booths drinking coffee. A television quietly played above the counter. The smell of bacon and fresh pie filled the room. For a moment, everything felt normal, comforting, human. Ranger settled beside Mason's booth. The waitress smiled. "The usual?" Mason nodded. She disappeared toward the kitchen. For several peaceful minutes, he enjoyed the warmth. Then a shadow fell across the table. Mason Cole. The voice was smooth, confident. The old seal looked up. A tall man stood beside the booth. Expensive coat, perfect haircut, polished boots. The kind of man who always looked comfortable, even in winter. Mason recognized him immediately. Trent Holloway, owner of Holloway Development Group. The same company forcing him off marina property in 7 days. The same company buying up shoreline land throughout the region. Trent smiled. "Mind if I sit?" Without waiting for permission, he slid into the booth opposite Mason. Ranger immediately lifted his head, watching. Trent noticed. "Beautiful dog." Mason said nothing. The developer folded his hands. "I hear you've been spending a lot of time out near the northern shore." A warning bell rang somewhere inside Mason's mind. "Carefully," he replied. "I walk." "Of course." Trent smiled again. "But not many people walk where you've been walking." The old seal held his gaze. The diner suddenly felt much quieter, much smaller. Trent leaned back casually. "Find anything interesting?" There it was. The question. The reason for the conversation. Mason answered carefully. "Just trees." Trent chuckled. "That's not what I've heard." Ranger emitted a low growl, almost too quiet for anyone else to notice. Trent's smile faded slightly. For the first time, something colder appeared behind his eyes. Not anger. Calculation. He studied Mason for several seconds, then stood. "Well," he adjusted his coat. "If you happen to discover anything unusual, let me know." Mason looked up. Why? Trent smiled once more, but this time the smile never reached his eyes. Because some things are worth more than people realize. Then he walked away. The bell above the door jingled, and he was gone. Silence settled over the booth. Ranger continued staring at the entrance. The old SEAL slowly exhaled. Every instinct told him the conversation had not been accidental. Trent knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Far too much. Outside, snow continued falling across Flathead Lake. The ghost ship remained hidden among the cliffs, waiting, watching. And now Mason knew he wasn't the only person searching for answers. Someone else had already joined the hunt, and judging by the look in Trent Holloway's eyes, they were willing to do almost anything to find what the ship was hiding first. The snowfall continued through most of the night. By dawn, Flathead Lake looked untouched. Fresh white snow covered the docks, the shoreline, and the winding road leading to the marina. To anyone else, the world appeared peaceful. To Mason Cole, it felt like a battlefield waiting for the next move. He stood beside the camper window, coffee warming his hands. Across the small table lay the Project Iron Harbor documents. Beside them sat the final eviction notice. 5 days left. The number seemed smaller every morning. Ranger sat near the door, watching, waiting. The German shepherd had barely taken his eyes off Mason since their encounter with Trent Holloway. Animals noticed things people missed, and Ranger clearly didn't trust the developer. Neither did Mason. The old SEAL folded the documents and slipped them inside his jacket. Let's finish what we started. Ranger stood immediately, tail low, ears forward, ready. An hour later, they were once again moving through the forest toward the hidden inlet. The journey felt different now, no longer an exploration. Now it felt like a mission. The frozen air burned inside Mason's lungs. Snow cracked beneath his boots. Above them, crows circled through the gray sky. Everything around him seemed sharper, more important. Every sound, every shadow, every movement. The conversation with Trent Holloway had changed the rules. Someone knew about the ship. Someone wanted something inside it. And someone had likely been searching for it long before Ranger stumbled across the inlet. The thought stayed with him as they emerged from the trees. The giant vessel appeared exactly as before. Silent, massive, frozen into the lake like a relic from another world. Ranger wasted no time. The dog headed directly toward the ship. This time he ignored the main deck entirely. Instead, he led Mason toward the lower access hatch they had discovered the previous day. The hatch remained slightly open. Snow had drifted against its edges. The old SEAL brushed it aside, then climbed inside. Darkness swallowed him immediately. The narrow compartment smelled of rust and cold steel. His flashlight beam cut through the shadows. Pipes ran along the walls, old valves, electrical panels, storage lockers. Most appeared abandoned. Yet Ranger moved forward with complete confidence. The dog's nose worked constantly, searching, tracking, following something invisible. Mason followed. The passageway descended deeper into the vessel. Soon, the sounds of the outside world disappeared entirely. No wind, no birds, no movement, only silence. The kind of silence that made every footstep sound too loud. The corridor eventually ended at a steel wall. At first glance, there appeared to be nothing unusual about it. Just another section of the ship. But Ranger stopped. The German shepherd stared directly at the wall, then pawed at it. Once, twice, 3 times. Mason frowned. What is it? Ranger pawed again. The old SEAL moved closer. His flashlight revealed faint scratches along one edge. Not damage, a seam, very narrow, almost invisible. His pulse quickened. He ran his hand along the metal. The surface felt slightly different near the corner, less corroded, cleaner, as though it had been touched more recently than the surrounding steel. Mason pressed against it. Nothing happened. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Then he noticed a small recessed handle hidden beneath layers of grime. Well, now. Using both hands, he pulled. At first, the panel refused to move. Then a loud metallic groan echoed through the compartment. Dust drifted downward. The wall shifted, slowly, reluctantly. A concealed doorway emerged from the darkness. Mason stared. Someone had hidden an entire room behind a false wall. His flashlight swept across the opening. Rows of shelves appeared. Metal cabinets. Storage crates. Boxes. Dozens of them. The room looked untouched, as if no one had entered for decades. Ranger moved inside first. The dog sniffed every corner carefully, then relaxed, satisfied. Mason stepped through the doorway. The air felt colder inside, almost preserved. His flashlight revealed markings on several crates. Most were faded beyond recognition. Others displayed Cyrillic lettering, Russian, Cold War era. Exactly what he expected. He opened the nearest cabinet. Inside sat stacks of damaged files, thousands of pages, some moldy, others water-stained, many tied together with military-style tags. His heart began beating faster. This wasn't cargo. This was an archive, a hidden archive. Someone had concealed records here, important records. The old seal selected a folder and opened it. Shipping manifests, coordinates, cargo transfer authorizations, dates, crew assignments. Many referenced Project Iron Harbor. The name appeared repeatedly, again and again, like the center of a giant puzzle. Mason spent nearly an hour examining documents. The deeper he looked, the stranger things became. Cargo shipments lacked descriptions. Destinations were missing. Entire sections had been intentionally removed. Nothing was complete. Everything felt designed to conceal the truth. Then Ranger barked. Once, sharp, urgent. Mason looked up. The dog stood near the far wall, staring, waiting. What did you find? Ranger scratched at the floor. Mason approached. The flashlight beam revealed scorch marks, burn marks. A large pile of partially destroyed papers lay nearby. Someone had tried to burn records here. A lot of records, but they hadn't finished. Several pages survived. Mason carefully lifted one. Most of the text had been destroyed. Only fragments remained. Yet one surviving section caught his attention immediately. Transfer complete. Primary assets moved to vault compartment. His breath caught. Vault compartment. The phrase appeared twice more on nearby pages. Not archive compartment. Not storage compartment. Vault compartment. A completely separate location. The hidden room wasn't the final destination. It was only part of the secret. Ranger barked again. The dog moved toward another wall. Mason followed. His flashlight revealed something unusual. A map. Burned around the edges. Pinned behind a cabinet. He carefully removed it. Most of the paper had been damaged, yet enough remained to show the ship's internal layout. Several sections were marked. Engine rooms, crew quarters, storage areas. Then one location stood out. A heavily shaded section near the lower stern. No label, no description. Only a black square and an arrow. The arrow pointed downward, below everything else. Mason studied the map, then compared it to the layout he had already explored. The marked section didn't appear on any visible plans, which meant it had been intentionally hidden. His pulse raced. The archive room had never been the goal. It was a decoy, a place designed to distract anyone who came looking. The real secret remained somewhere deeper inside the ship. Much deeper. Ranger suddenly stepped forward. The German shepherd lowered his nose against a steel bulkhead. Then he froze. Mason moved beside him. At first he saw nothing. Then the light revealed it. A faint outline, perfectly rectangular, barely visible beneath layers of rust. Not a wall, a door. Hidden, concealed, waiting. The old SEAL slowly ran his fingers across the metal. The shape became clearer, large, heavy, industrial. A vault door. His heart pounded. For several seconds he simply stared. The hidden archive room, the burned records, the missing cargo, the mysterious map, everything pointed here. Everything. Ranger sat beside him, watching, waiting. The old SEAL swallowed hard. What the hell were they hiding? The steel door offered no answer. But standing there in the darkness, Mason understood one thing. Whatever lay behind that vault was important enough for people to erase a ship from history. Important enough to conceal for decades. Important enough that someone was still watching. And for the first time since discovering the vessel, Mason realized the truth. The ship itself was never the secret. The secret was behind the vault, and he had finally found the door. For several moments, Mason Cole simply stood there. The beam of his flashlight rested on the hidden steel vault. Dust drifted slowly through the cold air. Behind him, the archive room remained frozen in silence. Rows of forgotten files, burned records, fragments of a mystery decades old. But none of that mattered now. Everything pointed to the vault. Whatever Project Iron Harbor had been. Whatever cargo had disappeared. Whatever powerful people still seemed interested in the ship, the answers waited behind that steel door. Ranger sat quietly beside him. The German shepherd's eyes never left Mason, as though waiting for his next decision. The old SEAL slowly approached the vault. The door stood nearly 7 feet tall. Heavy industrial hinges disappeared into the surrounding steel. A circular locking mechanism dominated the center. Military grade. Without question. Mason ran his gloved hand across the cold surface. The steel felt solid, immovable, built to survive generations. He examined every inch of it. No obvious weaknesses. No emergency release. No visible access panel. Nothing. Whoever designed the vault wanted it to stay closed, permanently. The realization brought both excitement and frustration, because Mason already knew the truth. He wasn't opening that door alone, not with a flashlight and a pocket knife, not even with military experience. This required someone else, someone who understood locks, someone who understood ships, someone who understood old military security systems. A name immediately surfaced in his mind, Owen Briggs. Mason stepped back. The decision was made. We need help, partner. Ranger stood. The dog seemed almost relieved, as if he had already reached the same conclusion. The journey back to the marina felt longer than usual. Snow fell steadily across the mountains. The hidden ship disappeared behind curtains of white. Yet the image of the vault remained locked inside Mason's mind. Every step raised new questions. How valuable was whatever lay inside? Why had someone hidden it? And more importantly, who else knew it existed? That final question followed him all the way home. The answer arrived sooner than expected. As Mason approached the camper, Ranger suddenly froze. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward. His body stiffened. A low growl emerged from deep inside his chest. Instantly. Mason knew something was wrong. He followed the dog's gaze. The camper door stood slightly open. Just a few inches. His pulse quickened. He distinctly remembered locking it that morning. The old seal immediately scanned the surrounding area. Empty marina. Snow-covered docks. No visible movement. Yet every instinct screamed danger. Not immediate danger. Recent danger. Someone had been here. Ranger moved forward cautiously. Nose working. Tracking. Mason slowly pushed open the door. The sight inside stopped him cold. The camper had been searched. Not destroyed. Not vandalized. Searched. Drawers stood open. Cabinets emptied. Boxes moved. Blankets tossed aside. The intruder hadn't been looking for money, or electronics, or valuables. They had been looking for information. Mason's jaw tightened. Someone wanted something specific, and they believed he had it. Ranger moved through the camper, sniffing, following scent. Then the dog stopped near the table. The Project Iron Harbor documents. Gone. The folder Mason had left behind was missing. For several seconds, silence filled the camper. Then the old seal slowly sat down. His expression remained calm, but underneath, anger was building. Not panic, not fear. Anger. The controlled kind. The dangerous kind. Ranger returned to his side. The dog pressed his nose against Mason's hand, grounding him, keeping him focused. The old seal scratched behind the dog's ears, then stood. Let's see where they went. Outside, Ranger immediately picked up the scent. The German shepherd moved across the snow-covered marina with complete confidence, past the empty docks, past the storage sheds, toward the road. Mason followed. The trail continued for nearly half a mile. Then Ranger stopped near a fenced property overlooking the lake. Mason stared through the falling snow. A large sign stood beside the entrance. Holloway Development Group. His stomach tightened. Trent Holloway. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe. But the timing felt impossible to ignore. Ranger growled again. The old seal studied the property. Several vehicles sat inside. Construction equipment. Storage containers. Private security cameras. Everything looked normal. Yet the feeling remained. Someone connected to Holloway knew far more than they admitted. Mason quietly turned away. Storming through the gate would accomplish nothing. Not yet. He needed proof, and more importantly, he needed the vault opened first. The following morning, before sunrise, Mason and Ranger left Flathead Lake. Snow-covered highways wound through western Montana. Mountains rose on both sides of the road. Frozen rivers cut through narrow valleys. The old pickup truck groaned with every mile, yet somehow it kept moving. 3 hours later, they reached a small mountain town tucked between pine-covered ridges. The town looked forgotten by time. Weathered buildings, old gas stations, a single grocery store, and near the edge of town sat a modest cabin surrounded by equipment, metal parts, generators, engine components. The property looked more workshop than home. Mason smiled faintly. Nothing had changed. Ranger jumped from the truck. The dog immediately began exploring the snowy yard. A moment later, the cabin door opened. A broad-shouldered man stepped outside. Gray beard, heavy flannel jacket, hands stained by decades of mechanical work. Owen Briggs, former Navy engineer, former ship security specialist, and one of the smartest men Mason had ever met. The older man squinted, then laughed. "Well, I'll be damned." Mason smiled. "Good to see you too." Owen walked forward. His eyes immediately landed on Ranger. "That's a fine dog." Ranger calmly sat, evaluating, judging, approving. Eventually, Owen nodded. Smart eyes. He got them from his partner. Owen laughed. Still making bad jokes, I see. The three of them entered the cabin. Warmth greeted them instantly. The smell of coffee and machine oil filled the air. Tools lined every wall. Blueprints covered several tables. Mechanical parts occupied nearly every available space. Mason felt as though he'd stepped into the brain of an engineer. After coffee was poured, Owen finally leaned back. So, he folded his arms. What kind of trouble brings you here? Mason looked toward Ranger. The dog rested near the fireplace, watching, listening. Then Mason spoke. I found a ship. Owen raised one eyebrow. A ship. Frozen into Flathead Lake. The second eyebrow rose. That's already strange. It gets stranger. For nearly an hour, Mason explained everything. The hidden inlet, the abandoned vessel, Project Iron Harbor, the archive room, the missing documents, the break-in, and finally, the vault. By the time he finished, Owen sat completely silent, thinking, processing, calculating. Finally, the engineer stood, walked toward a nearby workbench, and opened an old metal cabinet. Inside sat specialized tools, inspection equipment, security instruments, mechanical probes, items most people wouldn't recognize. Owen selected a heavy metal case, then turned toward Mason. How big is the lock? Mason smiled. The answer told him everything. Owen was already interested. Big. Owen nodded. Military? Definitely. The engineer snapped the case shut. Then we're leaving tomorrow. Mason blinked. No questions? Owen shrugged. I spent 30 years around Navy hardware. He looked toward Ranger, then back toward Mason. Nobody hides a ship in a mountain lake unless they're hiding something else. A slow grin appeared beneath Mason's beard. For the first time in days, genuine hope surfaced. Not hope for treasure, not hope for wealth, hope for answers. Outside, snow continued falling across the mountains. Far away, hidden among cliffs and frozen water, the ghost ship waited. Its vault remained sealed, its secrets remained hidden, but not for much longer, because now Mason wasn't returning alone. And somewhere deep inside the vessel, behind steel and silence and 40 years of forgotten history, something waited patiently. Something important enough to steal documents, important enough to attract men like Trent Holloway, important enough that people were willing to search a veteran's home to find it. The question was no longer whether the vault contained something valuable. The question was how far others would go to reach it first. The answer arrived the following morning. Snow clouds drifted low across the mountains as Mason Cole, Owen Briggs, and Ranger made their way toward the hidden inlet. The world felt unnaturally quiet. No birds, no wind, only the crunch of boots and paws across fresh snow. Owen carried a heavy metal case filled with specialized tools. Every few minutes he glanced toward the cliffs rising above the lake. The retired engineer clearly sensed the same tension Mason felt. Someone else was searching, and sooner or later, their paths would cross. Ranger moved several yards ahead. The German Shepherd had become even more alert since the break-in. His ears constantly shifted. His nose tested the air. His eyes never stopped scanning. The closer they came to the hidden inlet, the more uneasy Mason became. Years of military experience had taught him to trust instinct. And right now, instinct was screaming. Something wasn't right. When they finally emerged from the forest, the sight before them confirmed it. Fresh tracks, multiple sets, far more than before. Boot prints crisscrossed the snow-covered shoreline. Someone had visited recently. Very recently. Owen crouched beside one of the tracks. Not hikers. Mason nodded. The tread pattern looked tactical. Purpose-built winter boots. Professional equipment. Not tourists. Not fishermen. Ranger growled. The sound rolled low through his chest. Both men immediately looked toward the ship. The giant vessel still sat frozen in the inlet. Silent. Motionless. Yet somehow it felt different, as though the ship itself knew visitors had arrived. Owen stood. Let's move. The climb aboard happened quickly. Neither man wanted to waste time. Inside the vessel, they moved directly toward the hidden archive room. The concealed vault waited exactly where Mason had left it. Massive. Silent. Unyielding. Owen approached immediately. His eyes lit up, the way an artist might react to a masterpiece, or a scientist discovering something impossible. He examined every detail: the hinges, the locking wheel, the steel thickness, the construction methods. Finally, he leaned back and smiled. What? Owen tapped the vault. This isn't civilian. Mason crossed his arms. I figured. No. The engineer shook his head. You don't understand. His expression became serious. This level of security wasn't used for ordinary military storage either. Mason felt his stomach tighten. What was it used for? Owen studied the lock again. Strategic assets. The words hung in the air. Strategic assets. Not supplies. Not documents. Not equipment. Something bigger, much bigger. Ranger barked suddenly. One sharp bark, then another. Both men froze. The dog stood near the corridor entrance, body rigid, eyes focused, listening. Mason instantly recognized the warning. Someone was nearby. Very nearby. The old SEAL quietly moved toward the hallway. His pulse slowed. His breathing steadied. Years vanished. Training returned. Instinct took over. The corridor remained empty, yet faint sounds echoed through the ship. Footsteps, not theirs. Someone was aboard. Ranger growled. Owen whispered, You hear that? Mason nodded. The sounds came again. Metal creaking. Movement above. The old SEAL slowly pulled a flashlight from his pocket. Not as a weapon, as a tool. His mind remained focused on escape routes, observation points, defensive positions. The same skills that had kept him alive decades earlier. Another sound echoed through the hull, closer now, then silence, a long silence, too long. The ship seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Ranger suddenly exploded into motion. The German shepherd sprinted down the corridor before Mason could stop him. Ranger! The dog disappeared around a corner. A loud bark echoed through the lower decks. Then another. Then several more. Urgent. Aggressive. Mason ran. Owen followed. The corridor twisted sharply. Metal walls flashed past. Ranger's barking grew louder. They reached a stairwell leading toward the upper decks, and froze. Two men stood near the top. Dark winter clothing. Faces hidden beneath hats and scarves. Neither appeared surprised to see them. For a brief moment, nobody moved. The tension felt electric. Then one of the men glanced toward the vault corridor. The other looked directly at Mason, and both turned to run. They weren't interested in confrontation. They were interested in the vault. The realization hit immediately. They had been searching, trying to reach it first. Ranger lunged after them. The German shepherd flew up the stairs with incredible speed. Mason followed. The ship echoed with pounding footsteps. The intruders raced across the deck. Snow swirled around them. The frozen inlet stretched beyond the railings. One man reached the ladder. The other turned briefly, looking back, calculating. Then something happened. A section of ice near the hull cracked beneath the man's boot. The sound echoed sharply across the inlet. Everyone froze. For one terrifying moment, the ice groaned, shifted, then held. The men immediately abandoned caution. They scrambled toward the shoreline, desperate to escape. Ranger reached them first. The German shepherd intercepted the trailing figure near the base of the ladder. The man stumbled, lost balance, and crashed into the snow. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The second intruder spun around, trying to help his companion. Ranger placed himself directly between the men and Mason. Protective, fearless. Exactly as he had done countless times before. Then a sharp cry shattered the air. Ranger yelped. The sound hit Mason like a knife. The German shepherd stumbled. Snow beneath him turned red. Time seemed to stop. For a brief moment, Mason couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then training vanished. Emotion took over. "Ranger!" The old SEAL sprinted forward. The two intruders immediately retreated, disappearing toward the tree line. Neither man pursued them. Nothing mattered except Ranger. The German shepherd struggled to stand, one front leg trembling. Blood stained the snow beneath him. Mason dropped to his knees. His hand immediately began examining the injury. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious. A deep laceration across the shoulder, likely caused during the chaotic struggle near the ice. Ranger tried to stand again, still focused on protecting, still working. Even injured. Mason gently held him. "It's okay." The words barely escaped. "It's okay, partner." Owen arrived seconds later. His face had gone pale. "How bad?" Mason swallowed hard. "Bad enough." The engineer immediately removed a first aid kit from his pack. Together they worked quickly. Pressure. Bandages, careful examination. Ranger remained remarkably calm. Only his eyes betrayed the pain. The sight nearly broke Mason, because all at once he remembered every mission, every deployment, every dangerous moment. Every time Ranger had stepped between him and harm. Not because he was ordered to, because he chose to. The old SEAL rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. A silent moment. A private moment. One soldier to another. One survivor to another. Eventually, Ranger's breathing steadied. The bleeding slowed. The immediate danger passed. Yet something had changed. The mystery no longer felt like a game, or an adventure, or even a discovery. Now it felt personal. Someone had entered the ship. Someone had searched for the vault. Someone had caused Ranger's injury. And for Mason Cole, that changed everything. Owen looked toward the towering vessel, then toward the hidden corridor below. "We finished this today." Mason slowly nodded. Ranger lifted his head. The German shepherd's tail moved once against the snow, weak, but determined. The old SEAL managed a faint smile. "Yeah," he gently scratched behind Ranger's ears. "We finish it." Together they looked toward the ship, toward the vault hidden deep inside, toward the secret that had already drawn strangers, thieves, and danger. And as snow continued falling across Flathead Lake, Mason realized the truth. The greatest treasure inside the vessel might not be gold, or documents, or secrets. The greatest treasure was lying beside him, bleeding, loyal, and still refusing to quit. But before the day ended, the vault would finally open. And what waited behind that steel door would change all of their lives forever. Snow drifted across the frozen inlet as Mason Cole sat beside Ranger. The German shepherd rested against his leg. Bandages wrapped the injured shoulder. The bleeding had stopped, but the sight of the wound still twisted something deep inside Mason's chest. Ranger should have been resting. Instead, the dog remained focused on the ship, focused on the mission, focused on him, the same way he always had. Owen Briggs crouched nearby and secured the last latch on his metal equipment case. "We can still leave." Mason looked at him. The engineer shrugged. "If Ranger needs a vet, nobody would blame us." The old SEAL glanced down. Ranger immediately lifted his head. Amber eyes locked onto Mason. Alert, ready, waiting. The dog wasn't asking to leave. He was asking to continue. Mason smiled faintly. "You stubborn old fool." Ranger's tail moved once. Owen laughed. "Not sure which one of you you're talking to." The three of them returned to the ship. This time the atmosphere felt different. The mystery was gone. Now came the answer. Every corridor seemed quieter, every shadow heavier, every footstep louder. The vault waited exactly where they had left it. Silent, massive, patient. Owen knelt before the lock. His expression instantly changed. Focused. Professional. The look of a man doing what he was born to do. Mason sat nearby with Ranger. The dog rested against his boot while Owen began working. Minutes passed, then more. The old engineer carefully examined every component. The locking wheel, the mechanism housing, the hinges, the steel construction. Occasionally he muttered to himself. Numbers, measurements, observations, the language of machinery. Finally, Owen looked up. "This thing is real." Mason raised an eyebrow. "No kidding." Owen shook his head. "You don't understand." He tapped the steel. "This wasn't built for paperwork." The engineer's eyes narrowed. Whatever is inside was considered extremely important. The words settled heavily inside the room. Mason already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt different, more serious, more dangerous. The work continued. Hours seemed to pass. The only sounds came from metal tools and distant groans from the aging ship. Then finally, click. A small sound, barely audible. Yet it echoed through the corridor like thunder. Owen smiled. One. Mason sat forward. Ranger lifted his head. The engineer returned to work. Another click followed. Then a third. The tension slowly tightened. The ship itself seemed to be waiting, watching, holding its breath. Finally, Owen stopped. The engineer leaned back, exhaled, and stared at the vault. "What?" Mason asked. Owen looked at him. "I think that's it." Silence filled the compartment. Nobody moved. Even Ranger remained perfectly still. The old engineer placed both hands on the wheel, then slowly turned. At first, nothing happened. Then deep inside the vault, something shifted. A heavy metallic sound echoed through the ship. One bolt, then another, then another. Massive locking mechanisms disengaged one by one. The noise seemed endless, like a sleeping giant waking from a 40-year slumber. Mason felt his pulse pounding. Ranger rose carefully despite the injury. The German shepherd moved beside him. The final bolt released. The wheel stopped turning. Owen stepped back. Nobody spoke. Then Mason approached. His gloved hand rested against the vault handle. For a brief moment he hesitated. Years of mystery, years of secrets, years of lies. Everything waited on the other side. He pulled. The door moved. Slowly, reluctantly. A blast of stale air escaped from the darkness beyond. The vault opened. Silence. Then flashlight beams swept inside, and all three of them froze, rows upon rows beyond counting. Metal shelves filled the chamber. Wooden crates, steel containers, sealed cases. Every inch of the room packed with valuables. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The sight overwhelmed language itself. Mason stepped closer. One crate sat partially open. He lifted the lid. Inside rested neatly stacked gold bars, dozens of them, each stamped with serial numbers, each wrapped for preservation. The gold gleamed beneath the flashlight. Real, solid, heavy. Owen stared. Oh my God. Mason opened another container. Bearer bonds. Thousands of them, protected inside waterproof sleeves, still intact, still valid, still worth fortunes. The next crate contained velvet trays, gemstones, emeralds, rubies, diamonds, enough to light the darkness with reflected color. The vault stretched deeper than either man expected. Every shelf revealed more wealth, more assets, more treasure. The value became impossible to calculate. Millions, then tens of millions, then far beyond. Mason slowly lowered himself onto a nearby crate. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This wasn't hidden cargo. This wasn't a forgotten stash. This was a financial reserve, an enormous one, built intentionally, protected intentionally, hidden intentionally. Owen shook his head. No wonder someone wanted this buried. Ranger remained beside Mason. The dog seemed completely unimpressed by the treasure. His attention stayed focused on the people. On his people. The old seal smiled despite everything. Smartest one in the room. Then Mason noticed something else. A smaller steel cabinet sat against the rear wall. Unlike everything around it, the cabinet carried no markings, no labels, no inventory numbers, just a lock, already rusted open. He approached carefully, opened the door. Inside sat a collection of ledgers, documents, files, organized, protected, preserved, the real secret. Mason opened the first ledger. Names, dates, transactions, payments, transfer records. His eyes widened. The entries continued for decades, not years. Decades. The last entry appeared surprisingly recent, only 6 years old. Mason froze. That wasn't possible. The ship had been abandoned for decades, yet someone had continued updating records. Someone knew the treasure existed. Someone had been tracking it, protecting it, managing it, even after the vessel vanished. The realization hit harder than the gold, harder than the diamonds, harder than the fortune itself. The treasure had never truly been forgotten. Someone remembered. Someone always remembered. Owen studied several pages. His face slowly drained of color. Mason. The old seal looked up. The engineer pointed toward one name, repeated again and again throughout the records. Different decades, different transactions. Same family, same surname. Powerful people. Connected to the hidden assets, connected to the ship, connected to the secret. The implication was obvious. Generations had protected this fortune. Quietly, carefully, waiting. Ranger suddenly growled. Low, deep, warning. Both men looked toward the corridor. A sound echoed through the ship. Not footsteps, engines, vehicles. Outside, approaching, fast. Mason immediately stood. His instincts activated. The old SEAL moved toward the deck. Owen followed. Ranger limped beside them. When they reached the railing, the sight below stopped everyone cold. 3 black SUVs had appeared near the hidden inlet. Government vehicles, official vehicles. Their doors were already opening. Several men stepped out. Dark coats, professional posture, purposeful movement. Not local police, not reporters, not developers. Something else, something higher. The lead figure looked directly toward the ship, toward Mason, toward the vault, toward the treasure. The man raised a hand. Not a greeting, a signal, as if he already knew exactly what had been found. Owen quietly exhaled. That was fast. Mason stared at the vehicles, at the men, at the ship. Then back toward the open vault hidden beneath them. The truth finally became impossible to ignore. The treasure had never been forgotten. It had never been lost. Powerful people had known exactly where it was. And now that the vault was open, they had come to claim it. The real battle was only beginning. The black SUVs remained motionless near the shoreline. Snow drifted across their windshields. Dark figures stood beside them, watching the ship. Watching Mason. Watching the secret that had remained buried beneath ice and steel for decades. The frozen inlet suddenly felt smaller. The mountains felt closer. The sky felt heavier. Mason stood at the rail beside Ranger. The German shepherd remained pressed against his leg, favoring his injured shoulder but refusing to rest. The dog watched the newcomers carefully. Every instinct remained on alert. Owen adjusted his glasses. Government? Maybe. Mason wasn't certain. But one thing felt obvious. Nobody drove 3 SUVs into a hidden mountain inlet because they were curious. They knew exactly why they were there. Within minutes, the visitors reached the base of the ship. The lead man removed a glove and raised an identification wallet. Federal Recovery Authority. His voice echoed upward. We'd like to speak with Mr. Mason Cole. The old SEAL exchanged a glance with Owen. Neither man looked surprised. The arrival had happened too quickly. Far too quickly. Someone had been monitoring the ship, monitoring the treasure, monitoring everything. Mason slowly descended the ladder. Ranger immediately followed. The dog positioned himself beside Mason's leg. Protective. Silent. The lead official appeared to be in his late 50s. Gray hair, expensive winter coat, calm eyes. The kind of man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He offered a hand. Mr. Cole. My name is Victor Hale. Mason ignored the handshake. Victor didn't seem offended. Instead, he glanced toward the ship. Our office became aware of your discovery. Pretty fast. Victor smiled slightly. Certain discoveries attract attention. That answer told Mason everything. The man wasn't here to explain. He was here to manage. Control. Contain. Victor continued. The vessel may contain materials connected to historical federal operations. May? The official didn't answer directly. Instead, he removed a sealed envelope. We're prepared to resolve this matter quickly. Mason stared at it, then at Victor, then back at the envelope. What's in it? A proposal. The old SEAL took the document, opened it, and immediately understood. A settlement offer. Large. Very large. Far more money than Mason had seen in years. Enough to erase every debt. Enough to buy a home. Enough to change his life. Yet something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. Victor folded his hands. Our office would appreciate your cooperation. Mason looked up. Meaning? meaning we assume responsibility for the vessel and its contents. The silence that followed seemed endless. Snow continued drifting across the inlet. Ranger stared at the official, unblinking. Victor remained calm, professional, patient, as though he expected the answer. Mason slowly folded the document, then handed it back. No. The official blinked. Only once. You should consider it carefully. I already did. Victor's expression tightened slightly. Not anger, disappointment. The kind people feel when a simple solution becomes complicated. Before he could reply, another vehicle appeared on the distant road. Then another. Then another. The unexpected convoy rolled toward the inlet. Owen stared. What now? Within 20 minutes, the answer became obvious. Reporters, news crews, camera operators. The story had escaped. The secret was no longer secret. Someone had leaked the discovery. Or perhaps too many people already knew. Either way, the result was the same. By sunset, helicopters circled above Flathead Lake. News vans lined nearby roads. National media arrived. The abandoned ship hidden among the mountains became the biggest story in Montana. And Mason Cole found himself at the center of it. The following week felt like a storm. Not a weather storm, a human storm. Interviews, phone calls, questions, rumors, speculation. The story spread across every major network. Former Navy SEAL discovers hidden Cold War treasure. Veteran and loyal dog uncover forgotten fortune. Mystery ship found frozen in Montana Lake. Every headline seemed larger than the last. Yet Mason barely paid attention. His focus remained elsewhere. Ranger. The dog required treatment, daily monitoring, rest. The injury was healing well, but not quickly. Each morning, Mason checked the bandages. Each night, Ranger slept beside his bed. The old SEAL found himself watching the dog constantly, as though afraid something might happen, as though years of loss had taught him to expect the worst. One evening, while replacing Ranger's dressing, a knock sounded at the camper door. Mason opened it. A woman stood outside. Dark winter coat, briefcase, sharp eyes, professional posture. She extended a hand. Claire Whitmore. The name meant nothing at first. Then recognition appeared. Maritime law, salvage rights, one of the best attorneys in the region. Claire smiled. I think you're going to need a lawyer. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours. By the time it ended, Mason understood the situation far better, and far worse. The treasure was only part of the battle. Ownership would determine everything. Federal agencies were already preparing arguments. Insurance groups were investigating. Financial institutions were reviewing historical claims. Private interests were emerging from everywhere. Everyone wanted a piece. Claire spread several documents across the table. Fortunately, maritime salvage law is fairly clear. Mason leaned forward. Meaning, if the vessel is abandoned, your discovery gives you significant rights. Hope flickered briefly, then vanished. Claire's expression hardened. Unfortunately, certain people are trying to change that. She slid another document forward. Mason read the name. Trent Holloway. His jaw tightened. The developer had filed multiple legal motions. Claims regarding shoreline ownership, claims regarding access routes, claims regarding jurisdiction, anything that might create leverage, anything that might delay the process, anything that might weaken Mason's position. Claire tapped the paperwork. He moves fast. The old SEAL laughed bitterly. I noticed. Outside, snow tapped softly against the camper windows. Inside, Ranger lifted his head. The German shepherd studied Claire carefully, then slowly relaxed. A small gesture, but meaningful. The dog trusted very few people. Claire noticed. I'll take that as approval. For the first time all evening, Mason smiled. The following days became increasingly chaotic. Deputy Eli Turner visited twice. Reporters camped near the marina. Strangers drove past at all hours. The quiet life Mason once knew disappeared completely. Yet the most surprising change came from the town itself. People began stopping by. Veterans, dock workers, local business owners, retirees. People who had known Mason for years. Some brought meals, others offered help. Many simply wanted to shake his hand. The support felt strange, unexpected. After years of feeling invisible, suddenly people noticed him. One afternoon, while watching the lake from outside the camper, Deputy Turner approached. The law officer removed his gloves. "You know Holloway's furious." Mason nodded, not surprised. Turner looked toward the frozen lake. "He's been buying shoreline property around here for 20 years. The statement lingered. Mason turned. "What does that have to do with the ship?" Turner hesitated. For a moment it seemed he might say more. Then he stopped himself. "Just be careful." The deputy walked away, leaving Mason with more questions than answers. That night, after everyone had gone home, the old SEAL sat beside Ranger. The camper felt quiet again. Not peaceful, just quiet. The television played muted news coverage about the discovery, the treasure, the ship, the legal battle, the growing national attention. Mason eventually turned it off, then looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd rested comfortably despite the injury. Older now, slower, yet still loyal beyond measure. The old SEAL scratched behind the dog's ears. "You know what worries me?" Ranger lifted his head. Mason stared through the window toward the dark lake. "It's not the treasure." The dog listened. "It's losing everything again." The words came quietly, almost a whisper. The fear surprised him, not because it existed, because he finally admitted it. Claire believed they could win. The law appeared favorable. The evidence seemed strong. Yet life had taught Mason a painful lesson. Sometimes deserving something wasn't enough. Sometimes people with power changed the rules. Outside, the wind swept across Flathead Lake. Inside, Ranger rested his head against Mason's knee. The gesture lasted only a second. Yet it was enough, a reminder, a promise. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. But somewhere beyond the growing media attention, beyond the lawyers and government officials and treasure hunters, another secret was waiting. A secret hidden not inside the vault, but inside the names written within those ledgers. And before the battle ended, that secret would expose the real people who had spent decades searching for the ship. Spring arrived slowly in western Montana. The ice covering Flathead Lake began to crack. Snow retreated from the lower hillsides. Streams of meltwater ran through the forests. Yet despite the changing season, the pressure surrounding Mason Cole only intensified. The legal battle had become national news. Every major outlet covered the story. The abandoned Cold War ship, the hidden vault, the veteran and his loyal German shepherd, the fortune frozen beneath a mountain lake. What began as a local mystery had become something much larger. And now everyone wanted answers. The most important answers sat inside the ledgers recovered from the vault. Claire Whitmore spread copies across a conference table inside a temporary office overlooking the lake. Stacks of documents covered every surface. Names, transactions, shipping records, correspondence, financial transfers, 40 years of carefully hidden history. Mason sat quietly near the window. Ranger rested at his feet. The dog's injured shoulder had healed significantly. He still limped slightly on cold mornings. But every day he looked stronger. Every day he seemed more like himself. Claire adjusted her glasses, then pointed toward one page. We finally found the connection. Mason leaned forward. Several names had been highlighted. Some belonged to long-dead businessmen, others to financial intermediaries, a few connected to former shipping companies. But one surname appeared again and again. Holloway. The room fell silent. The old SEAL stared at the documents. The names stretched across decades. Different first names, different generations, same family, same pattern. The realization settled heavily. Trent Holloway wasn't simply interested in the ship. His family had been hunting it. For years. For decades. Maybe longer. Claire opened another folder. Inside sat copies of private correspondence recovered from the vault. Letters. Memorandums. Transfer authorizations. All pointing toward the same conclusion. Members of the Holloway family had known about Project Iron Harbor, known about the treasure, known about the hidden vessel, and spent years trying to locate it. The old SEAL slowly leaned back. So this was never about development. Claire nodded. No. She tapped the documents, the shoreline purchases, the land acquisitions, the abandoned marina, the remote properties. Her voice hardened. They weren't investments. Mason looked up. They were search areas. The attorney nodded. Exactly. A long silence followed. Outside the office windows, Flathead Lake shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The water was beginning to reappear as the ice melted away. The season was changing. And so was the story. Deputy Eli Turner arrived later that afternoon. The law officer closed the office door behind him. His expression was unusually serious. I have something. Claire looked up. The deputy placed a folder on the table. Inside sat property records, old survey maps, land ownership documents, several dated more than 20 years earlier. Turner exhaled slowly. I shouldn't even have access to some of this. Mason studied the pages. His eyes widened. The maps revealed something remarkable. Every major land purchase made by the Holloway family formed a pattern, a search grid, expanding year after year. The locations slowly narrowed toward the hidden inlet, toward the ship, toward the treasure. Claire shook her head. My God. The deputy nodded. They were looking for it. Mason stared at the evidence. The hidden vessel had not been forgotten. It had been hunted, patiently, relentlessly, across generations. The Holloways simply never found it, until Ranger did. The court hearing began 3 weeks later. The small Montana courthouse overflowed with people. Reporters crowded every available seat. Camera crews lined the walls. Veterans filled the back rows. Townspeople packed the gallery. Outside, satellite trucks filled the parking lot. The entire nation seemed to be watching. Mason sat beside Claire. Ranger rested at his feet. The German shepherd wore a service vest. His calm presence grounded the old SEAL more than anyone realized. Across the room sat Trent Holloway. Perfect suit, perfect posture, perfect confidence, at least at first. The proceedings lasted hours. Arguments filled the courtroom. Ownership claims, jurisdiction disputes, historical records, federal interests, corporate interests, legal theories, competing interpretations. Then Claire stood. Everything changed. The attorney approached the judge's bench carrying several boxes of evidence, the same ledgers, the same maps, the same records. One by one, she presented them. Patiently, methodically, clearly. The courtroom grew quieter with every document, quieter with every revelation, quieter with every connection. Eventually, Claire displayed the search grid maps. Gasps spread through the room. The visual evidence was undeniable. Year after year, property after property, the Holloway family had systematically searched for the ship. The judge studied the maps carefully, then the ledgers, then the financial records. Finally, Claire delivered the final blow. A letter, recovered from the vault. Written decades earlier, the contents directly referenced a private agreement involving members of the Holloway family, an agreement to locate and secure the hidden assets. The silence inside the courtroom became absolute. Even Trent looked stunned, because for the first time, the truth was public. Not rumor, not suspicion. Proof. The judge removed his glasses, then looked directly at Trent Holloway. The developer's confidence finally cracked. Only slightly. But enough. Enough for everyone to see. Enough for everyone to understand. The villain had never been the government. The villain had never been bureaucracy. The villain had been greed. Generational greed. A family obsessed with finding wealth they believed belonged to them. The hearings concluded several days later. Then came the ruling. The courthouse overflowed again. Nobody wanted to miss it. Mason sat quietly beside Ranger. The old SEAL appeared calm, yet inside, his stomach twisted. Years of military service had taught him patience, not certainty. The judge entered. The room stood, then sat. The ruling began. Legal terminology filled the chamber. Historical references, maritime law, ownership standards, abandonment doctrine, evidence review. The speech seemed endless. Then finally the judge reached the conclusion. The vessel had remained abandoned for decades. No valid ownership claim existed. The evidence overwhelmingly supported salvage rights. And those rights belonged to Mason Cole. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled. Spectators whispered. Veterans applauded. Claire smiled for the first time in weeks. Deputy Turner closed his eyes in relief. Ranger simply looked up at Mason. Waiting. The old SEAL lowered a hand. The German shepherd pressed his head into it. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The courtroom, the cameras, the treasure, the victory. None of it mattered. Only the dog beside him, the partner who had led him to the ship, protected him, saved him, stayed loyal through every step. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged forward. Questions flew from every direction. Mr. Cole, how does it feel? What will you do with the money? What about the treasure? What about the Holloways? Mason paused. The crowd quieted. The old SEAL looked toward Ranger. The German shepherd stood proudly beside him. Then Mason answered. The truth matters. The reporters leaned closer. For 40 years, he continued, people hid this story. His eyes moved toward the courthouse behind him. They buried it. They protected it. They chased it. He looked down at Ranger, but they never found it. A faint smile crossed his face. My dog did. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Then applause, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang across the lakeside town. The battle was over. Justice had won. The people who spent decades chasing the treasure stood exposed, humiliated, defeated. Yet as Mason looked across Flathead Lake that evening, he realized something important. The treasure had changed his life, but not in the way anyone expected. Because the greatest reward wasn't sitting inside a vault. The greatest reward was still waiting. And 2 years later, it would become clear to everyone what the real treasure had always been. Summer sunlight spilled across Flathead Lake. The water shimmered beneath the Montana sky like polished glass. Pine-covered mountains stood guard along the horizon. Fishing boats drifted across the open water. Families gathered along the shoreline. Laughter carried through the warm afternoon air. The place felt alive, very different from the forgotten marina where Mason Cole had once counted down his final 7 days. Very different from the frozen lake where Ranger had disappeared into the fog and changed everything. The abandoned ship was no longer abandoned. The vessel that had once swollen trapped in ice now rested permanently at a renovated dock overlooking the lake. Its rusted steel had been restored, its decks repaired, its history preserved. A polished sign near the entrance welcomed visitors from around the country. The Iron Harbor Veterans Center, the name meant something now. Not because of the treasure, because of what the treasure had become. Mason stood on the upper deck watching visitors move below. Some toured the museum exhibits. Others attended counseling programs. Many simply sat near the water. Veterans talking quietly with other veterans. People who understood things that few civilians ever could. The center had become exactly what Mason hoped. A place where nobody had to explain their scars. A place where silence was understood. A place where healing could begin. Footsteps approached behind him. Claire Whitmore joined him near the railing. The attorney smiled. "Big day." Mason nodded. Below them, hundreds of people gathered near the main dock. Television crews, local families, veterans organizations, service dog trainers, reporters, donors, volunteers. People had traveled from across the country for the dedication ceremony. Claire looked out across the lake. Hard to believe. The old seal smiled faintly. Which part? All of it. Mason understood. Sometimes he still struggled to believe it himself. 2 years earlier, he had been living inside an aging camper, haunted by nightmares, crushed by debt, waiting to lose the last thing he owned. Now he stood on the deck of a restored ship overlooking a center that helped veterans rebuild their lives. Life could change quickly, sometimes because of luck, sometimes because of courage, and sometimes because a dog refused to stop following his instincts. A familiar sound interrupted his thoughts. The steady click of claws against metal decking. Mason turned. A smile immediately appeared. Ranger. The German shepherd moved more slowly now. Age had finally begun catching up with him. Gray fur had spread around his muzzle. His injured shoulder occasionally stiffened, yet his eyes remained exactly the same. Alert, loyal, wise. The dog crossed the deck and settled beside Mason, as though taking his usual post, as though he belonged nowhere else, which, in many ways, he didn't. The center had become famous for one reason beyond the ship itself. Service dogs, dozens of them. The program had expanded far beyond Montana. Veterans arrived from every corner of the country. Many left with trained dogs walking beside them. Dogs capable of interrupting panic attacks, providing stability, offering companionship, saving lives, just as Ranger once saved Mason's. The German Shepherd had become the symbol of the entire organization. Photographs of him appeared throughout the facility. Visitors often asked to meet him. Veterans sought him out. Children loved him. Yet Ranger seemed completely unaware of his reputation. He remained exactly who he had always been. A working dog. A loyal partner. A friend. Nothing more. Nothing less. The ceremony began shortly after noon. Rows of chairs filled the dock. Flags moved gently in the breeze. The lake sparkled behind the stage. Mason stood waiting near the podium. Public speaking had never been his favorite activity. He had survived combat missions, classified deployments, life-threatening situations. Yet standing before a crowd still made him nervous. Claire noticed. "You'll be fine." Mason laughed softly. "That's easy for you to say." A voice interrupted them. "You've faced worse." Deputy Eli Turner approached. The former law officer had become one of the center's strongest supporters. Beside him walked Owen Briggs. The retired engineer looked older, happier too. The four friends exchanged smiles. A simple moment, a quiet reminder of everything they had survived together. Eventually, the master of ceremonies called Mason forward. Applause spread across the crowd. The old SEAL walked slowly to the podium. Ranger followed. Of course he did. The dog settled beside the stage as the applause continued, then gradually faded. Hundreds of people waited, listening. Mason looked across the audience. Veterans, families, children, service dogs, people whose lives had intersected with this story in ways both large and small. For a moment he simply stood there, taking it all in. Then he began. "2 years ago," he said, "I thought my life was over." The crowd remained silent. The lake breeze carried gently across the dock. "I had lost my wife." He paused. The memory of Emily still hurt. Always would. "I lost my home. I lost my future." His voice remained steady. But mostly, he glanced toward Ranger. "I lost the belief that things could get better." The audience listened carefully. No cameras clicked. No reporters interrupted. Everyone seemed to understand this wasn't really about treasure. It never had been. Mason continued. "People ask me about the vault." A few smiles appeared. "They ask about the gold, the bonds, the money." He looked out across the water. "They call it the greatest discovery of my life." The old SEAL paused again, then shook his head. "They're wrong." Silence. Complete silence. Mason pointed gently toward Ranger. The German shepherd immediately lifted his head. The crowd followed the gesture. Many already knew where the story was going. Others didn't. Mason smiled. The greatest discovery of my life wasn't hidden inside that ship. Emotion slowly entered his voice. It wasn't inside the vault. It wasn't waiting behind a steel door. His eyes never left Ranger. It was standing beside me. The crowd grew quiet again. Several veterans lowered their heads. Others nodded slowly, because they understood. More than anyone. They understood. Mason stepped away from the podium, walked toward Ranger, and knelt beside him. The German shepherd immediately leaned against him. The familiar gesture, the same one that had carried them through nightmares, through grief, through loneliness, through fear. The old SEAL rested one hand on Ranger's neck. "Every time I thought I was alone," his voice softened, "he was there." The lake shimmered behind them. The mountains stood silent beyond the water. The entire crowd watched. Not a treasure story. Not a victory story. A loyalty story. A survival story. A story about purpose. Mason scratched gently behind Ranger's ears. The dog closed his eyes briefly. Content. Peaceful. Exactly where he wanted to be. The applause began slowly. One person, then another, then dozens, then hundreds. People rose to their feet. Veterans, families, children, everyone. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Not for the treasure, not for the ship, for the bond, for what it represented, for everything that could not be measured in dollars. Later that evening, after the crowds departed, Flathead Lake grew quiet again. The sun drifted toward the mountains. Golden light painted the water. Mason sat alone near the bow of the restored ship. Ranger rested beside him. Neither felt the need to speak. The moment said enough. The old SEAL watched several veterans walking along the shoreline, each accompanied by a service dog. One man laughed for the first time all day. Another stood comfortably in a crowd. A third simply looked peaceful. Small victories, yet powerful ones. The kind that changed lives. Mason smiled. The treasure had funded buildings, programs, treatment, opportunities. But the real gift had been something else. Purpose. A reason to wake up. A reason to keep moving forward. A reason to believe tomorrow mattered. The sun touched the horizon. Orange light reflected across the lake. Ranger shifted slightly beside him. Mason rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "Thank you." The words barely rose above a whisper. The German shepherd looked up. Calm, faithful, present. Exactly as he had been from the beginning. The wind moved gently across the water, and as evening settled over Flathead Lake, Mason realized something simple. The abandoned ship had given him a future. The treasure had given him purpose. But the reason he survived long enough to find either one had never been hidden inside a vault. It had been walking beside him all along, and in the quiet golden light of sunset, veteran and dog sat together overlooking the lake, no longer lost, no longer alone. Finally home. If you believe loyalty like Ranger's is one of the greatest treasures a person can have, comment 1 below. If you've ever had a dog, friend, or loved one stand by you through hard times, comment 0 and tell us where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories about justice, dignity, perseverance, and the unbreakable bond between people and their dogs, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next story.